thanks Dennis, Lori, and the teams at the Art Center and Locus that invited me. I'm going to try to lay myself bare in front of the public, and you will see how I do that in many ways. Because you often talk about the shows that you do, but not very often the life-changing reasons for doing things or not doing them anymore. So I want to share with you what I've learned from the different moments in my life, going from architecture into curating, and now the work that I'm doing at FLORA. So I started in this profession. I came, from another way than the usual one of studying art history and then doing curatorial studies like you do nowadays. I studied architecture. And when I was doing architecture, this is the beginning of the 80s, postmodernism was in its height. And one of the most important architects at the time was Ricardo Bofill, the Catalan architect that was designing these extravaganzas, Roman-inspired and neoclassical social housing in the outskirts of Paris. He was a star, and he was called by François Mitterrand, who was the president at the time of France, the greatest living architect. But going deeper into his work, I noticed this building. And it looks like a sort of transformer. And it is some kind of transformer. It's called Walden 7. And it's a social housing that came with an utopia included. So much so that many people left. But I was intrigued by it. So it's a building that where everything is like set so that you don't have to consume, you don't have to buy things, and you will be, in a way, coaxed into living a communal life with others. And but I say, why Walden 7? Being brought up in Colombia, Walden doesn't ring any it's not a household name. So I said, well, why Walden 7? And then I learned that it was based on B.F. Skinner's, the very well-known behavioral scientist novel from 1948 called Walden 2 that depicted this sort of ideal community where money, there is no money, only work, and there is this exchange and communal life. So that led me into Walden, So I came to Thoreau through Bofill. Yeah, what are the odds? But I learned Walden, and I was fascinated by this idea of an utopia for one. Although in the cabin, he says that he had 3 chairs, 1 for solitude, 2 for friendship, and 3 for society. And that stuck with me. So then when reading Walden 2, I came across this sentence: no way of life is inevitable. You have to analyze the life that you're living, and you don't like it. If you don't like it, just change it. So you don't have to live the life, any life. You have the power to change it. But if you try to change it through political action, you will fall into the trap. So all you have to do is learn to do things your own way, but in order to do so, you have to pay the price. And to pay the price is to be ready to renounce to many privileges and things and do things the way you should do. So every time I've been stuck in a situation, I say no way of life is inevitable, and I move on. And I will show you some of those moments where I've invoked Thoreau through Skinner. So I started my career, like this convoluted way, because you usually study art history and then go and curate a show, and then you get seen by someone, and then you get invited to curate another show, and then you start maybe working for a small institution, and then, when you have enough experience, then you get drafted by a big museum, and you make a career there, and probably retire there. But not me. I started as an exhibition designer because it was the closest thing to architecture, back then. And then I worked my way up into this museum. It wasn't a museum when I started, and by the time I left, 18 years after, we had created the museum. It's called the Banco de la República Museum. It's funded by the Central Bank in Colombia. But it became bigger and bigger and bigger. We built that large building in 2004. We opened it. And then I thought that my contribution had been done. And it was time to move on, because in Colombia, nobody ever leaves a position, only when they die. And sometimes not even at that moment. They continue to control. So I said, it's time to go. So I said, no way of life is inevitable. I need to change. So I took the leap and became an independent curator. This is one of the famous art tunes by my friend, the artist and educator, Pablo Helguera. And I said, well, what the hell? I mean, I can use what I've learned so far to have a career as an independent curator. So I started, curating like curators do. But independent curators have a particular thing, is that they have to follow the projects wherever they are. They very rarely, it needs really a strong art scene so that you can stay in a given place. Maybe in New York it's possible, but certainly not in Bogota 10 years ago. So you have to follow the projects, and that is problematic because you are crisscrossing the globe, but whatever you do doesn't add up to a given public. It's different publics that are sort of seeing the shows that you do, one in Barcelona, one in Madrid, one in Buenos Aires, one in the south of Brazil, but they only add up in your CV. Nobody really you're not creating something for a given public. You're not educating the gaze of a given public, and I feel that that's very important. So I worked for the Sao Paulo Biennial. That was one of my first big gigs. And so when I was invited by Lisette Lañado, the chief curator, and I was part of this team of several curators. And she had this idea based on the critical thinking of Elio Itisica and his programs for life. So she had already an idea. We worked with her, and eventually we adopted the title from one of Roland Barthes' seminars, How to Live Together. So I was by far the less experienced of the 5 curators, and there were several themes in Lisette's original project. So the first one was a guest curator, so he was brought for that. It was an evaluation of the influence of Marcel Brothers in contemporary art. But then these other themes, architecture, collective life, reconstruction, exchanges, and Acre were there. So when it came to dividing the themes between us curators, all the others said, oh, I'm all about architecture. The other one said, I'm Mrs. Collective Life. And so on and so forth, and I was left with Acre. I didn't even know what it was. So I said, why do I get Acre? What is that? It turns out that Acre is formerly Bolivian land, and it's now a territory of Brazil, but it was Bolivian land, and at the height of the rubber boom in the late 19th century, the rubber became scarce. So they had to move into the jungle and more, and they ended up occupying that territory. And then when the Bolivian army tried to oust them, they were armed and they declared themselves an independent republic that lasted for 3 years from 1801 to 1804 in the middle of the jungle. So this has a very interesting post-colonial history. So I went there. It's far. You have to fly overnight. It's really like going to another continent, because Brazil is so big. And so I went there to Rio Branco, and I was in charge of organizing the residencies of several artists that went there. And it ended up being really a life-changing experience for me. First, I understood that sometimes it's better to let others choose and wait a little to see what happens, and that was the best thing for me. The other thing was that I worked with the artists that were doing the residencies there. This is Alberto Baraya from Colombia, who's been doing since the early 2000s this herbarium of artificial plants. So he receives plastic plants and paper plants from all over the world. He classifies them as if he was a botanist. And he's also followed the trips and the voyage of noted travelers in the Amazon, in the Putumayo, following exactly the path that they did, following their diaries, and finding plastic flowers in the middle of the jungle, because the penetration of culture into nature is incredible. So he went there, and knowing this history of rubber as the foundational myth of Acre, he decided to work with the former rubber tappers, because rubber is no longer an important industry there. So he, for several months, with a scaffolding covered in latex, this huge rubber tree. So instead of tapping it, he was sort of giving the latex back to the tree. So that was like several months, and then they cut and peeled the skin, as it were, of the tree, and then we showed it at the Sao Paulo Biennial at this sort of snake skin of the tree. And in the bottom part, there were the scars that years and years and years of tapping had made on the tree, which in a way mimicked the scars that the rubber trade left on the indigenous populations in Brazil. I also met this, I encountered the work of this self-taught rubber tapper, former rubber tapper, Elio Melo, who created these incredible works of art by, it is said, crushing leaves and barks, and with that as a pigment, he would paint these incredible maps of the jungle. This is a journey into the jungle of a day. So each one of the branches is a tree that he had to tap. So it's a map of time and also a map of space of the Amazonian jungle. And he did a very beautiful series of works where animals are on trees, where the rubber tree becomes a sort of cow because it's milked like the cow, but also foresees how the jungle has been raised in order to plant soy and to raise cattle. And also I worked with Marjetica Potric, an artist from Slovenia, who did this very beautiful project. It's called Florestania. In Portuguese, floresta means jungle. So they say in Rio Branco, if we live in the jungle, we cannot be citizens, because citizen comes from city, and we live in the jungle. So we are junglezens. So Florestania is the citizenship of the jungle. And following that idea of how to belong to the jungle, she did a series of drawings and a large installation that she usually sees urban chaos, for example, as a positive thing, and she tries to create a sort of manifesto for a given situation. So one thing struck with me is that they are so far from Sao Paulo, so far from every other place, that they don't aspire to go to the Sao Paulo Biennial. They are really enclosed in themselves, so they create a sort of closed society. But nowadays, they can't communicate with the rest of the world on their own terms. So what I took from this is that isolation can be a positive condition. And when you come from a third world country or in a city that doesn't have an international outlook, you tend to think that the only way to progress is to go away and to go to the centers. But I think you can create a center yourself, and that's part of the motivation behind FLORA. So, one thing that I also learned is that in the countries where I've worked, there are sometimes, there is a scarce money, there are scarce funds for the arts and culture in general, but somehow when there is an event, a lot of money is funneled into these events. So like a biennial, for example. So then a lot of money gets there, but then little remains after the big spectacular event comes to an end. So I thought it's an ethical imperative for a curator working in the third world to create or consolidate local infrastructure. You cannot just provide the content if you're invited to do one of these large events. You have to go beyond that. And I've tried to do that in several projects that I've done. For example, I was a co-curator of the polygraphic triennial in Puerto Rico, and we created this space designed by a collective from Canada to where the artists that we invited and the public could meet. We developed that further in Medellin for the Encuentro de Medellin, which was a large biennial type event. It's done every 4 years. It was the first incarnation. So we invited an artist to design the furniture, Gabriel Sierra, who was inspired by the shaker furniture, things that you just put on pegs. But the interesting thing is that it was beautiful when it started, but it really became alive as the exhibition progressed, because it was being reconfigured all the time to accommodate the myriad activities that we had as part of the Encuentro. And that was really very important. But one thing is that both the one that I showed previously and this one sort of slowly died out or ended after the biennial ended. So they were linked to that particular event, and they died with it. The last effort in doing this was in my project, the project that I did for the Mercosul Biennial in 2011. I proposed a very complex project that had many components, but one that was central, at least for me, which was called Casa M. It was originally called Casa Mercosur, but then I shortened it to put the stress on the casa part. And my idea was, let's use funds from the biennial to create a space for the public and the artists and the local scene that will bridge my biennial with the next one. So it will be used by me and my team as a lab going into our biennial, but then it will remain, and then it will be like an independent space, but funded by the biennial in the 2 years separating the first incarnation and the second incarnation, or the next one. And then it'll become something that will have a life beyond the biennial, and establishing this link between one and the next. So this was the biennial proper that we curated with a team of 5. And this was Casa M. It was a tiny house in a popular neighborhood in Porto Alegre. It was a very narrow house. And then there we had like a cafe on the first floor and space for projections, and a library that turned into a conference room, and a terrace, and some office space, and a small vitrine. That was the only exhibition space, because this was leading towards the biennial. So it was extremely successful, really very, very successful. And at first, the biennial didn't want to do it. They said, we don't want to create yet another institution, because they've already funded the biennial and also another museum in town. But I persuaded them. I said, this is central to my project. So they said, well, I don't know. And I said, wait, what if this is not a new institution? This is an artwork. I said, okay, if it's an artwork, we will fund it. So it was a more expensive artwork. They were not dumb, so they said, okay, we give you 1 year. So this was open several months before the opening of the biennial, and it served the purpose of bringing the docents. We prepared more than 300 docents for that were to be at the biennial, different sites. Each one of the curators interviewed in turn the artists that were coming for the biennial. So it really worked very well, and I was sure that once they saw this was really working, they would let it stay. And the artists even would not allow this to be closed down. They even demonstrated, Casa M has to stay, but no, the biennial said, we said one year, and 1 year it was. So, so I understood there that if I wanted to do things, they couldn't be associated to a temporary event, because it's like a parasite. It lives off the organism that it parasites, but it dies with it. So I said, if I'm going to do this, I have to do it on my own and not linked to a biennial. And this was the 8th biennial type event that I had done by then. We did Filagrafica with Lori and Julian Robson and 2 other curators, which was a citywide event in Philadelphia that was really very well received. We worked hard, more than 4 years, creating the institution that would create in turn the event. It was supposed to be a quadriennial, but then we didn't find the funds to continue, so it just folded, which begs the philosophical question, what do you call a biennial that only happened once, So then, yeah, I had, when I was interviewed for the press for the Mercosul Biennial, said, well, what's your next thing? And I said, well, one thing is sure, I won't do any more biennials, because I don't want to leave my family for 2 years, to have to travel 20 times in 2 years to another. I did that for 4 years, and it was a stress on my family and my daughters. It was really very difficult, so I said, I won't do any more biennials. I didn't say anything about triennials, though, so no, I'm joking. So in Colombia, we have a saying that necessity has the face of a dog, and I didn't have a job, so they offered me if I wanted to participate in the competition for the Taipei Biennial. So I said, well, I said no, but who knows, life is showing me a path, maybe I have to take it. So I formed a team, and I proposed a project that was called Imperial Nature, which was to deal with the relationship between the colonial enterprise and the scientific discourse, particularly botanics. So I was shortlisted. I was flown to Taipei, so 36 hours to get there, and then I had to defend the project. And I think deep down I was saying, I hope I don't get it, I did my best, but if I get it, I will have to come, and I will have to do it, and it will be 2 more years of doing this project. Finally, it didn't happen. Somebody else got selected, but I said on my way back on the plane, if I don't get it, then this will be the blueprint for a new project that I will do. This idea of a relationship between art and nature, but is also fraught with all the political implications that science and botanics has in our countries. So there is this tension between institutions and independent spaces, but in reality I think that's a false opposition, because you are independent no matter whether you are inside an institution or outside. You have to have this independent spirit. So the tension is more between the institutional and the para-institutional. But institutions, I believe in institutions because they have continuity, and they really, if they do things well, they can help create and cultivate an audience. And that's very, very important. Independent curators, as I said, are hired guns. They go here and there. We go here and there. And you end up being like a footnote in the program of several institutions worldwide, but it doesn't add up. So I thought, why don't we take the good things about institutions, which is continuity and the possibility of creating and cultivating an audience, and the independent, which is the ability to change without going through much red tape, because the problem of institutions is their inertia. It's very difficult to change things, especially in big institutions. So we decided to create FLORA. And I say we because this is a joint venture with my wife and partner for 35 years, Adriana. And so we said we have to do it ourselves. So 20 years back, 25 years back now, we decided we'll only live on one salary. Everything that I make will be put aside for some project that will come someday. Well, that project ended up being this, so we were able to acquire a little house, the ugly little house there, in this working class neighborhood called San Felipe. And we turned it into a small institution called FLORA. That started like most independent spaces do, as an exhibition space. Only that in our case, it was linked to short-term residencies in another house that we had, like a country home that we had acquired many, many, many years before. So we said, if this is a family project, we might as well throw it all in. So this weekend home became the residency place, and this house became the exhibition space. So we started with these month-long residencies, and then we had exhibitions as a result, or sometimes we just showed the process. So the place is called Honda, like the motorcycle. Yeah, it's a Spanishization of an indigenous name. So all the colonial enterprise came through the Caribbean and upstream through the Magdalena River to this place, and they established the city. And it was very important during colonial times, but then after independence in the 19th century, commercial navigation on the river died out, and the city also died out. And so we had acquired this little house and turned it into this residency place, where we brought the artists. They stayed 1 month in average. Honda has the reputation of being the warmest place in Colombia. It is close, it's not entirely true, but it's almost true, so it's really hot. And since we're so close to the equator, we don't have seasons at all. So it's always above, I don't know, it's like 90, 35 degrees. Yeah, between 35 and 40, it's really hot. So our idea was that we would bring the artists, let them sizzle in the heat, and any preconceived idea they might have had would evaporate, and they would have like a clean head to think through new projects. So this is the place where they stayed. This is the living room that doubled as a studio. And then we spent a lot of time with them, just cooking together, going to the market, and then they would think of a project, and we would try to produce it. Sometimes it was too short, 4 weeks is too short to actually think of a new project, but sometimes they could, and they did. So, for example, Mark Dion, who you know very well, he was one of the first residents, and he said, well, I want to mimic this idea of the European traveler that came to the Americas and then sent back specimens to Europe, and then professional draftsmen drew the botanical plates but I would add sort of a layer to that. My botanical illustrators will be Colombian artists that will be living there with me. So we rented another house. We had 6 illustrators. So Mark would go in the mornings, make his rounds, collecting insects and little animals and seeds and rocks and also objects, from material culture. And he would put them on a box, and they would each take one object and make a postcard, which were sent to Bogota, where we had this beautiful cabinets done. And by the end of the residency, there were like 6 large cabinets one with animals, one with plant, one with rocks, and one with objects, in a sort of drawing cabinet from the 19th century, which was one of the most beautiful exhibitions we've done so far. Or Carlos Garayco, an artist from Cuba, who has worked on this idea of the ruin as the metaphor for, the architectural ruin as a metaphor for the ruin of a political project. So he went there and he saw this part of the Gualí River that has that sort of pillar there and none on the other side. And he asked around and he learned that there had been the railroad there, but of course they let the railroad die out, as it happened in most of Latin America. So this, which signified the future for a country in the 19th century that was sort of just in the process of being established, this signified the future, but that future never came. So what he did was to recreate the bridge that had fallen down 20 years before in pins and threads, and it remained there in this large photograph as a sort of, you cannot see it, but it's there. Let me see if this, there. It's the ghost image in pins and thread of the future that never was. One thing that made me go from my job at the Banco de la República is that when you run a large institution, you get less and less time to be with the artists, and that defeats the whole purpose, because at least I am in the arts because I like art, but especially I like the artists. I like to be with them. I learn from them. So I was not spending enough time with the artists because I was just busy running around because we had 8 different spaces at this institution, and I was just busy producing the shows or installing them. So I thought, the next project that I do has really to be about building community, creating community in many ways. So at FLORA, one of the things that we've had from the beginning regarding the neighborhood that we're on is this vitrine that we call the cabinet, of course based on the idea of the cabinet of curiosities. So it's a way that to have art in a place where the public that is not accustomed to go to art spaces can see it. So there is always an exhibition, and there is a poster that tells what it is about, and people can see it without entering FLORA. And it has worked really well in creating this sort of awareness that we are there, because we arrived like a sort of ovni, a UFO that landed in that working class neighborhood, and they were sort of wondering what are they doing? How come nothing happens, and then all of a sudden on Saturday there are lots of people with the green hair, and so little by little they have become accustomed to us, doing things there. There have been performance-based works like this one by Ana Maria Davis. This is one of my favorite pieces. It's by an artist from Bucaramanga that was trained as an engineer, and it's called Honey, I'm Home. And there were these 2 robotic arms that are like talking, and then it seems that like the partner comes from work, and then she says, or he says, look what's here, like what is, and they wonder and they discuss, and they were looking at the little plant and looking at the vitrine, at the viewer, and I think it made me really well what the neighbors were thinking about us, what is this FLORA thing? It didn't help that we had a flower shop just besides FLORA, so they thought we were competing with them. So another thing that we did to establish a presence in the community was to we hosted this project that had been going on for a while called Echando Lápiz, which in Spanish is an expression for doodling around. And there are botanical expeditions in the neighborhood. So every Sunday, two artists, Manuel Santana and Gabriela Duarte, were there. The neighbors knew that they were going to be there. And then whoever showed up, they would give a pencil and paper, and they would go through the sidewalks and the front yards and sometimes the backyards in the neighborhood, doing a botanical expedition, trying to draw whatever they found. That was super effective in creating links with the neighbors. And also we have every other month what we call the Chocolate con los Vecinos. In Colombia, in Bogota, we don't have tea at 5, we have hot chocolate and pastries. So that's what we do. We invite them to have chocolate with us, and then we discuss the projects that we are thinking of doing, and we also discuss things that pertain to the life of the neighborhood, like the absence of trees, how the garbage is not, is thrown into the sidewalks, things like that that are not really our concern, but that could become our concern, and I will show you how. So, in 2016, 3 years after we had started the project, there was the possibility of acquiring the house that was behind. So we fundraised like crazy, and we were able to buy it, but it was really broken down. So we had to tear it down, and then we did more fundraising, and then created a new space there. And I will show you. So we built it in 6 months. It was a very difficult process. So we were at the same time building the building and fundraising for it to be built. So it was really a very stressful process. But not only that, we also were fundraising for a program, because once you have a space, you have to fill it with something. And we wanted it to be something really different. So when we had short-term residencies, we could do the curatorial accompaniment ourselves. The curator in residence and myself. So we would take turns in going to the studios and talk with the residents. But then this building was going to have many more studios. So that meant that we had to do something different, not just giving them a studio, but creating a dedicated program for them. And that is what we did. So that's the building being finished. That's the wall that divided the two houses being torn down. We created a garden that links the two buildings. And then we had on the ground floor a new library. That's me fundraising right there, which is what a curator does these days. And that's the building when we finished it. And we have a rooftop terrace, and I will talk about that later. So 2 buildings, the original house, which had 4 studios, two little apartments, the project space, which is where we really articulated this theme of art and nature. We were bringing artists whose work dealt with these issues. And then the library went to a new building. Here we started a cafe in the place of where the library was. We created a garden, and we're still working on that. And then we had 14 new studios, plus the 6 that we had, 20. So what do we do with 20 artists? we create a program. So that's what we did. The program is called Escuela FLORA, and we had this sort of old-fashioned name, Escuela, school, on purpose to say, well, an art school can be many things. It can be, for example, a practice-based program. So what we do is that we give each artist a studio. They are not super big, but they are big enough. And they stay there for 1 year, one entire year. So we have 20 artists that stay in average 1 year. Sometimes we have shorter grants, but we like the 1 year grants because you can immerse yourself in the local community. You can have downtime to think. You can have production time. And of course, we have open studios for them. So in 2016, we changed again. So we dropped little by little the short-term residencies in Onda and started with the long-term residencies plus the independent study program called Escuela FLORA. And so the artists get the studio, as I said. They also get the independent study program, which is seminars every month with artists, curators, critics that give them a 3-day seminar, and then the rest of the time is spent giving each one of the artists a studio visit, which is something very important because you get information fairly easily nowadays. You can listen to TED Talks, you can listen to any talk nowadays, but and you can get studio space. Well, sometimes it's difficult, but you can get that. But what is more difficult to get is feedback on your work. And that is the core of what we do, give feedback to the artists. So they have the seminars in preparation for the visits of the tutors. We have the group crits. So we divide the group in 3, and they take turns visiting each other's studio. We shuffle the group again, and then they get other people. So they are peer-to-peer discussing the works between themselves, and that's proven really effective. We have meetings with indigenous elders from different communities because we don't want, if we're touching upon these issues of art and nature, who would know better than the people that are in the jungle? So this is, for example, Don Abel, with whom I've worked several times in the past. He's an elder from the Muinane community that does these incredible botanical illustrations, and that has been, we did a small show that you see there, and then he was suddenly picked up by the international artistic community, so he went from the jungle to Documenta in no time. And he is currently at the Carnegie International. He will have an exhibition at the Newlyn Art Gallery in Cornwall. And his drawings are amazing. So we have meetings with different indigenous elders, and that's really very important. Every time somebody interesting comes to Colombia, we invite him or her to give a talk. And we do every other month field trips to different places that have a botanical interest in Colombia, near Bogota. We also have 2 or 3 moments where the public can visit the studios and see what the artists are doing. One in May, one in October, that coincides with the art fair that brings more than 500 people from all over the world. So that gives them visibility. And we do a small collective show in another space because FLORA is too small to accommodate a large exhibition. So this year we changed again. We said, well, it's good, but what if we give the artists the project space and we don't do any more exhibitions? We will sort of use that space as a lab space for them. So we started working with past residents in this project that is called Colaboratorio. The school became public because up to then it was like the Whitney program. Only the residents got to see the speakers, But now we are opening that to the public. And then we did another project with nature that I will talk about. So we post, every one of the seminars is, we reserve 30 slots for the general public, and they come. It has been very, very effective. So that is yet another service that we're giving to the community. So Tania Candiani, Miguel Lopez. We also have another part is that the residents are receiving, but they have also to give back. So we said, why don't you collaborate between yourselves, and every month you give a workshop for the community. And they are doing that. The more practical ones are the more effective ones, like this stencil workshop. And this is a cheesy moment in the talk. This cheese-making workshop was a hit with the local community. It worked really well. And we started doing exhibitions of the past residents, like Ana Maria Davis, who did this incredible large-scale print with stamps that will be shown at Pinta in December. So you will have the opportunity to see this wonderful work. But then, since we, when we were selecting the first artists, we were in a predicament. Should we choose them because their work deals with nature, or should we choose them because they are the best artists in each one of the open calls? And we opted for the latter. So the Escuela FLORA program doesn't have a nature sort of core, or it's not, it doesn't bring together artists that are necessarily, whose work necessarily deals with nature. So we lost that part there. And since we are not using the project space for exhibitions anymore, which is where we had this nature-based theme, then FLORA, where does this core theme, where is it going to reappear? So we have been soul searching recently. So one way that we've dealt with is creating a new project. This is the building as seen from behind. So in Colombia, there is a relation between the income of a given neighborhood and nature and trees. You know, the wealthiest neighborhoods have lots of trees, and the less wealthy neighborhoods have none. So we wanted to right that wrong by creating a project that will be both a garden and a tool to teach about permaculture and gardening and such. So this is the neighborhood as seen from above. That Kids, Cats, and One Dog is a permanent piece by an artist from Iran, Arhavan. So that's one thing we are doing, creating a garden, and this is evolving all the time. So first we let it just grow wild, and now we are restructuring it. So it's a project by Nicolás París, an artist from Bogota, whose works are always educational devices. So this is how it looks right now, and it has yet to grow. It will be, that structure will hold these trees as if they had fallen on top, and that will become a green canopy like it happens in the rainforest. So these are some views of it. But just to close, what happens? We are in this defining moment right now because my wife and I have been doing in the last year nothing but fundraising. So I haven't been able to really involve myself in the program. And then, as I said, it defeats the purpose. So what happened to me at the Banco de la República is happening to me now. So I'm saying no way of life is inevitable. I have to do something about it. So the way we fund the project is that each one of the studios has a different funder. So the funding is shared by many, but that has a problem that you have to fundraise a lot, because to get 20 grants, you have to go to 40 institutions, and then you probably get half of it. So we said, no, this is no way to live. We have to do something else. So now we are changing. So my wife, who is a lawyer, she worked in the law sector for many years, and then she started to work in the cultural sector. And then I persuaded her to come to FLORA and work full-time with me. But she says, I didn't come to this world to write checks. I have to do something else. This is our budget. So after 35 years together, she's finally found her true calling, which is what is called holistic life and holistic science and sustainable life. And she's doing that. So right now, what we are doing is to change again the program. Next year will be a sort of transitional year, so that we will have 2 programs in the future. One of them is, instead of having all these tutors, we will have only 4, and they will be the expedition leaders of 4 expeditions. 1 to the Amazon, 1 to the Pacific coast, 1 to the Putumayo, and 1 to the Sierra Nevada. And all of the teaching will be done on site during the expedition. So it will change again, and we will see what that brings. And the other thing is that we will fundraise less, so we will have less residencies, only in the new building, and the old building will become, that space will become an open space to develop a new project that will be run by Maria José Arjona, who is a performance artist who performed at MoMA with Marina Abramovich, and she will be training a group of artists interested in performance and dance into this new project that we don't know, it's yet to be named. So that's about what I wanted to share with you, and thanks for bearing with me.